So maybe we could start by explaining what is a ZED.
Well, as said, is zones for employment and economic development. Legally, the Constitution of Honduras describes them as a special regime in which part of the Honduran territory is subject to special rules. And then these special rules consist of one, a liberalized market economy, and two, I would describe it as a political, administrative, and legal autonomy to set up a local government with powers and abilities and responsibilities that have traditionally been handled at the central government level, such as enacting commercial and labor legislation. They have decentralized monetary authority. There is the property registries, entity registries, which are traditionally handled at the national level. Now they're handled in ZEDEs at a local level. Local police, a local prosecution, and so forth and so forth. So legally, they are a political subdivision of the Honduran territory with important amount of autonomy that allows them to enact special and different rules to those that generally apply to the rest of the country.
What is the purpose of the ZEDE legislation?
Well, their origin is in 2010, and the idea was that Honduras needed to change, and I think there should not be much disagreement on that premise. And in 2009, we had a very strong political crisis, and there was a lot of thinking and fear of what the future was going to be for Honduras at that point. So the idea was that, well, Honduras may continue to face these different political instabilities and keep facing all of these challenges that it has traditionally faced. And these special zones were seen as a mechanism for us to be able to create spaces within the Honduran territory that would become, I would describe them as an oasis of legal stability, and would be resistant to any political disturbances that might occur at the national level. The purpose is to replicate the success of special economic zones in China and also the United Arab Emirates, and also to reduce poverty at an accelerated level. So the whole ZEDE regime is intended to incorporate into Honduras market institutions and to provide it with sufficient autonomy so that it can resist and develop itself in an independent manner or in an independent way from the rest of the national institutions that have failed to provide proper conditions for economic development. So yes, that's the essential idea. That's the purpose, is to accelerated poverty reduction by creating special zones through which the country can incorporate market institutions and ideally replicate the success that we have seen from other, not only special economic zones, but also other countries such as Taiwan and South Korea and general the Asian tigers that through the incorporation of or the transition to market economies have been able to reduce poverty at accelerated levels or paces.
Who are the main proponents of the Honduras ZEDE legislation?
Well, historically, from a political perspective, it has been it is something that grew within a certain sector of the national party. Honduras has a couple of political parties, and traditionally they have not been so different. They're usually conservative parties, the Liberal and National Party, and but the National Party had a slight since the 90s. It had a slight influence in liberal economic thinking, and so that got the conversation started. And in 2010, There's a lawyer, Octavio Sanchez. He was chief of staff to President Lobo, of the National Party, and he was one of the main crafters of the ZEDE organic law. So he worked with also Eval Diaz. Eval Diaz at that time in 2010, he was the main legislative counsel to the president of Congress, Juan Orlando Hernandez. So they worked together with another team of Hondurans, and they were able to harness the political support to get the legislation passed. Like I said, the idea was to replicate the success that other special economic zones have had in other countries, particularly United Arab Emirates and China. But not only the special zones as a mechanism to deploy them, but more broadly a market institution. So the president of the country back then, Lobo, and president of Congress, Juan Orlando Hernandez, with some members of the Supreme Court and Octavio and Naval and some other Honduran leaders. They visited all of these countries, and of course, as you may know, Paul Romer was very very important in.
Who was Paul Romer for people who don't know?
So Paul Romer, he's an NYU economist. In 2018, he was awarded the Nobel Prize on economics, and he was also chief economist at the World Bank. This was before he was at the World Bank, and before he had the Nobel, he was already very well known and recognized as an economist. And he did a TED talk about charter cities, and his idea was that in developing countries, you could have as a mechanism to help them develop, you could designate particular areas of a country and have them be administered by developed countries. That was his broader idea. He called them charter cities, but that was how it worked. But the idea was to establish a mechanism through which institutions that had demonstrated to be favorable to economic growth could be transplanted to countries that were currently lacking those institutions. So he saw charter cities as a way to do that, and he was invited by the Honduran politicians, the Honduran leadership at that time, and they started working to enact legislation to that effect. This was very fast. In 2009 we had the crisis, and by 2010 the constitutional amendments were already being passed through Congress. And then there was some complications because we were heading to a very contested elections. And these new elections in 2013, they saw for almost 200 years there had only been two political parties in Honduras, but these elections in 2013 saw the emergence of two new and powerful parties. One was very to the left side of politics and aligned with the socialist governments of Venezuela, Cuba, and at that time Ecuador and Bolivia were also part of that group, and that made ZEDEs a very controversial issue for those elections. And essentially, all of the opposition political parties, they took a position against ZEDEs, and they were able to rule them unconstitutional before the Supreme Court of Honduras. And that essentially killed the initial attempt to develop special development zones. Back then, they were called REDs, special development zones. And but then the National Congress, after they received a ruling from the Supreme Court, again, Octavio Sanchez and Eval Diaz, they started working to amend the special zones legislation so that it would be compatible with what the Supreme Court was saying. And then they got it passed again through Congress, and another constitutional amendment was made. So in 2013, we were finally able to get these special zones recognized by the Honduran Constitution and by a ZEDE organic law. And in 2014, the Supreme Court of Honduras said that this ruled these zones to be constitutional. So that's a little bit of the history. After 2014, what we've seen is the government of Honduras and several investors and private parties working to set up the institutional framework under which these zones would be developed. And in 2017, December, the first ZEDE got approved. That was Prospera ZEDE, and back then it was called ZEDE Village of North Bay. And then in 2019, the second ZEDE was approved. That's ZEDE Morazan or Morazan City. And I believe I'm actually not quite sure the date, but somewhere between 2019 and 2020, a third ZEDE got approved, and that's ZEDE Orquidea. Prospera is based in the Bay Islands in Roatan. It's a Caribbean islands, former British colony that are part of Honduras. And then we have ZEDE Morazan. That one's being developed in Choloma. Choloma is like a traditional maquila or manufacturing hub in the Cortes department, it's a northern department of Honduras. And then we have ZEDE Orquidea or Orchid, which is in San Marcos in Choluteca. That's the southern department that has the borders with the Pacific Sea. So those are the three ZEDEs. Each of them are targeted or specialized in different areas of the economy. And well, that's essentially the current status. And we're in Honduras. We're going to elections this year in November, and of course, it's become a very contentious subject again. But this time, ZEDEs not only
Are there any other ZEDEs in production? Is it just those three, or are there any fourth and fifth that might be coming soon?
I understand that there are many applications. Former Minister Valdez publicly stated that there were around 22 requests or applications for the ZEDE regime. So I don't know how many of those will be approved, how advanced they are, but there are around 20 something applications according to Valdez. He's also a member of the CAMP, the Committee for the Adoption of Best Practices. That it's the administrative organ of the Honduran government that is in charge of approving ZEDEs.
And in terms of the opposition, you mentioned that the original legislation, the red, was struck down. That it's been a political hot topic issue ever since the program started, and that now with the upcoming elections, it's a contentious issue. I want to go into the elections a little bit later, but first, can you tell me why exactly people are opposed to ZEDEs in the first place?
Yes, to be honest, I think the main driver of the opposition is that they associate ZEDEs with the ruling party. So ZEDEs have been promoted by the National Party as their main policy tool for economic development. And the National Party, at the same time, and after 12 years, almost 12 years in government, they are very, I would say, worn out, after 12 years in government. So they have a lot of corruption scandals, and the conditions of the country have not particularly gotten better during these 12 years. So we have high levels of poverty. Over 60% of the population lives under poverty. The bureaucracy, it's a burden on entrepreneurs and businesses, and the taxes. Well, the National Party has raised taxes, and they have applied very aggressive tax collection procedures, sometimes violating due process. So there's a lot of things going wrong, for the National Party, and when the general public, National Party leaders talk about the ZEDE regime, they become skeptic, and they think it's part of a corruption scheme or something to damage the country. So that, I would say, that is the main reason why people are opposed to it. That's at the macro level, and then we have a lot of another sector that is opposed. It's what I would call the regular like the intellectuals or intelligentsia of Honduras. You see all these, very recognized lawyers and professors and scholars. They're all against ZEDE, and they raise a lot of arguments to attack them. Basically, they claim that ZEDEs violate the Honduran sovereignty and that they represent disgregation or atomization of the national territory. And so they have like 30, 50, 60 reasons or claims of why it
let's
is.
go through them one by one, because I think that
Yeah.
this might be interesting. Let's go through the question of sovereignty. So first things first, it does seem like programs like the ZEDE do reduce national sovereignty, right? If the people who are doing business in the ZEDEs are exempted from a certain amount of business laws and business regulations, doesn't that erode the power of the central government? And isn't that a bad thing?
Well, there's two conceptions of sovereignty, and in the end, this is a little bit the problem because sovereignty, there's an international law definition, which is essentially being a country that's independent from other countries and can can enact its own norms and rules. That's at the international level, and there's a lot of philosophical and different conceptions of sovereignty. So the conversation gets a little broad, complicated, and abstract. But essentially, what the opposition is arguing is that because the central government of Honduras is losing powers, then that's a violation of sovereignty. So they say, for example, if the Honduran Congress has been the one that traditionally approves labor and commercial legislation, then how is it possible that now we're going to have a new these special zones that will be able to exert that power? And they say that essentially the Congress has unlawfully delegated these powers to the ZEDEs, and this goes even beyond ZEDEs, because under this understanding of sovereignty and the same social sectors within this opposition, they see it as a violation of sovereignty every time the state loses powers or privatizes a certain state-owned company or liberalizes an economic sector. Then every time the state withdraws from a sector of the economy or society, they see it as sovereignty that is being lost. And of course, when it comes to ZEDE, they see it as the most radical form of losing sovereignty. But I think it's also important to understand, going back to the original concept, is that ZEDEs are a local government. So it is not a private city in the sense that that there's no government there or something like that. Cities are a part of a territorial subdivision of the country, and just alongside municipalities and departments. And a city is a public government entity. So that's the first thing that's important to understand. It's a public government entity, a local government with great deal of authority, and the technical secretary, which is the authority responsible, of he's like the mayor or the executive power within the city. He has to be a Honduran-born citizen, and he's responsible and liable before the Committee for the Adoption of Best Practices for what's.
Tell us a little bit about the Committee for the Adoption of Best Practices, for those who don't know.
Yes, so the Committee for the Adoption of Best Practices, it's a organ of the Honduran government in charge of exerting supervision over ZEDEs. So it was appointed originally by President Lobo in 2013-14, and then it was ratified by Congress, its members. It's a 21-member committee. Originally, most of them were foreign academics and businessmen, but then from 2014 all the way to 2018, there were a lot of changes within its membership, and right now most of the camp's powers are exerted through a permanent commission, which is entirely composed of Hondurans. And this commission is the one in charge of, number one, approving application to incorporate incorporations into the ZEDE regime, and they are also in charge of exerting certain supervisory powers. They have to audit ZEDEs, and they also have the power to approve or veto the internal legislation of ZEDEs. So each ZEDE can adopt their own internal norms and regulations and on various and broad scope of matters, but then it goes to the camp, and camp approves or disapproves this internal legislation. So going back to the matter of sovereignty, when you can, there's two ways you can create a ZEDE. You can create a ZEDE through a public referendum if you're going to create it in a high population density zone. A high population density zone is understood in Honduras as a zone that has 35 or more inhabitants per square kilometer. So if you're going to develop a zone there, then you have to do a referendum. In that sense, I would say that, well, that's very clearly not a violation of sovereignty. If the people, through a referendum, they decide they want to live in ZEDE so that they can enjoy broader autonomy and enact different rules and regulations than those that apply at the national level, because they think that would be better for their development, security, safety, and overall progress. The other option, which is the one being currently, it was the mechanism used for the three existing ZEDEs, is for a ZEDE to be developed in a low density zone. In these low density zones, essentially, it's uninhabited land, it's greenfield areas, and private ownership. You have to accredit that you have private ownership, and there are no third-party claims. And before you can incorporate to ZEDE, if you have any third-party claims, you have to get those fixed or resolved. And in this one, what it allows is for private investors to incorporate private uninhabited lands into the ZEDE regime, invest into the design and structuring of a high quality governance system. And once that governance system is ready to go, then you open it for investors and residents and businesses, and people come to live and work there. Once the ZEDE, at the first stages, the ZEDE, it is controlled mostly by private parties, the property owner, the investors, and also the camp from the national government. But as soon as people start moving in, then they enjoy, of course, the regime. In the end, as a local government, it has to be responsible to its residents. So I said it has to enact a series of mechanisms for democratic participation. The ZEDE organic law states that once a ZEDE becomes a high population density, which is 35 or more residents per square kilometer, it is the residents that are going to go to elections to vote and elect the technical secretary, and the technical secretary will be presented to camp, and camp can either ratify or veto it if in any case the technical secretary doesn't comply with the legal requirements. But
wait, so the ZEDEs have it's not fully privatized governments. Once a certain number of people live within a ZEDE, then they have elected officials that are they're protected by law to represent them, right?
Yes, essentially. So the ZEDE organic law only provides or regulates two organs, or two governing organs over ZEDEs. That is the camp, and that is the technical secretary. The ZEDE organic law says that when it is uninhabited or low population density, then the private investors are going to nominate the technical secretary, and camp is going to approve it. But as soon as people come into the jurisdiction to work, live, start their businesses, or whatever it is they're doing there, but as soon as you have more than as soon as you have 35 or more persons within the jurisdiction, then the technical secretary has to be elected through through vote, through electoral process. However, because the ZEDE organic law is like 45 articles, something like that, and within that law, it states what norms or regulations are applicable. So essentially, within the ZEDE, you have the Honduran Constitution, as applicable. Then you have international treaties, the ZEDE organic law, criminal legislation. You have legislation concerning the territorial seas and the coasts of Honduras, legislation concerning the national flag, the anthem, and all that. And from that foundation, then a ZEDE it has and enjoys the autonomy to build its own governance institutions. But when a ZEDE is building its own governance institutions, it has to comply with international treaties such as the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, which essentially regulates how the political rights of persons with respect to their government. They have to be able to run for office. They have to be able to participate in decision making of public affairs. So the ZEDEs have flexibility on how they structure their governance organs and structure, but this structure that they set in place has to comply with all these treaties, which essentially create mechanisms, legal mechanisms for residents to exert their sovereignty through a local government. So essentially, that's the transition. On a recent paper I wrote for the Journal of Special Jurisdictions, that's how I describe it. It's called From National Politics to Local Democracies, because under the ZEDE regime, the most relevant key political decisions are it allows Hondurans to be able to make those decisions at a local level and not necessarily through the National Congress as traditionally has been done.
So in many ways, ZEDEs are really not that much different from any other local sort of governing body in Honduras. Do you think that a lot of the concerns about the erosion of Honduran national sovereignty stem from misunderstandings of what the ZEDE legislation does, or do you think that there are genuine concerns?
Well, I think most of it. I think that most of it it's a misunderstanding. I think there were legitimate concerns, particularly with regards to the governance part within ZEDEs, because, like I said, the ZEDE organic law is very short and doesn't really regulate that much. How the ZEDE's governance structure has to be. But the same ZEDE organic law tells you that you have to comply with international treaties. So then you have a broader idea of how these zones have to operate. And well, that should ease a lot of the original worries, because right now the conception is that essentially, and they think ZEDEs are private cities. They think that it's a part of the territory that is no longer governed by the Honduran state, but it is governed by private investors, which is not true. And because one, it's a public entity. Two, the Honduran state has a lot of mechanisms and in place to restrain or limit the ZEDE's autonomy. Number one, every single legislation approved by ZEDEs has to be ratified by the camp. The camp can also audit ZEDEs, and you also have a special judiciary that's in charge of exerting judicial control over ZEDEs. This special judiciary, it's directly dependent to the Supreme Court of Honduras. The judges are appointed by the Supreme Court. So no, it's not a private proprietarian community. It's a local government that has to comply with international treaties, and that it's intertwined with the greater Honduran state and governance institutions. And that's, well, of course, right now it's very hard to have a conversation about it because it's very political. So I don't think parties are really interested in having a serious conversation about it. So it's on the one side, the National Party promotes ZEDEs as a tool to create thousands of jobs, and on the other side, opposition claims it's a mechanism to sell the country in pieces to international investors.
So you mentioned earlier that the ZEDEs, which was I found really surprising, had the ability that citizens of a ZEDE have the ability to elect a technical secretary that acts as a sort of government representative. What rights, responsibilities, duties does a technical secretary have? Is it analogous to a mayor or a congressman? What does that look like?
Yes, the technical secretary First, you have the powers and responsibilities that the ZEDE organic law grants to the technical secretary, but then you have the powers, abilities, and procedures that each ZEDE can establish.
So there's the powers that are mandated in the ZEDE legislation itself that a technical secretary must have, and then each zone can add stuff on top of that, right?
It can add stuff or can restrain it. So they can subject a technical secretary's powers to certain procedures, like getting authorization from the residents or getting authorization from a council, or essentially you have a lot of freedom to enact mechanisms to control and provide authorization, essentially establish a checks and balances system. But yes,
So if the ZEDE can restrict the powers of a technical secretary, doesn't that mean that ultimately the ZEDEs and CAMP are basically sovereign as opposed to the Honduran states? Doesn't that just mean that the election of a technical secretary has become somewhat meaningless?
Well, let's say something like that were to happen, then remember that you have to analyze how is he being restrained. Is he being restrained in through mechanisms of Republican governance, or is he being restrained as a manner to suppress his
Well,
essential
are there
fiduciary
rules?
duties? Mm-hmm.
Are there rules in the ZEDE legislation that specify how the SEZs are able to restrain the powers of the technical secretary? Because otherwise it seems like it's ripe for abuse and it really does erode national sovereignty.
Well, not I don't see it that way, but it is definitely a risk in the sense that some laws and regimes can be unlawfully deployed, and that's why you have the special ZEDE jurisdiction that's going to exert judicial control over these matters. If you think that a particular provision of the governance framework of a ZEDE, it's violating this or that democratic right, or it's undermining the spirit or objective of the law, you can take it to the courts. And like I said, these courts are not dependent on ZEDEs; they are dependent on the judicial power. But the current mechanisms in place are essentially, at least let's talk for let's use a particular example. There was an initial debate because the ZEDE organic law states that technical secretary can promulgate legislation. So there was original debate if what does that mean? If the technical secretary is executive power and he can promulgate legislation, and then the ZEDE organic law doesn't really say much else, does that mean that the ZEDE organic that the technical secretary is a legislator? And I did a study on that matter, and my conclusion was that no, that all a legislative power has to be exerted through mechanisms of political representation, and that's what the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states. So once you have, let's say, people living there, and you have your internal governance system, yes, I think that residents of a ZEDE, they should be able to establish mechanisms to control the powers of their local government, whether it be a technical secretary or whether it be any other organs that might be created. So for example, some of the, let's say, Prospera ZEDE, one of the first ZEDE, they have established a series of mechanisms of democratic control, that there's supposed to be a check on the power of a ZEDE government. So let's say that the technical secretary promulgates a norm, then this norm can be vetoed by the public. So every single norm that is approved by the technical secretary, and in Prospera you have not only the technical secretary but also a Prospera council. 5 members of the Prospera council out of 9 are to be democratically elected, and even at that stage where the residents elect the majority of the Prospera council, when they approve a norm, that norm can be vetoed by the public. And also the technical secretary and the Prospera council members can be removed by forced referendums. So, I mean, that's the kind of restraints on power that you're able to establish. Of course, if you establish restraints on a technical secretary's powers in which they have other purposes, let's say non-legitimate or not constitutionally recognized purposes, for example, for individual private gain, then those would be incompatible with the nature of a ZEDE's constitutional autonomy and its obligations under international law.
So it seems like the main checks and balances on the power of a ZEDE stem from sort of two sources. The first source that we've covered is a citizen's ability to sue the ZEDE in a standard Honduran court of law that is itself not controlled by the ZEDE, right? And the second one comes from CAMP. Is this correct?
Yes. So you have, I would describe it as three levels. First, you have CAMP, that has the power to veto the appointment.
And I want to go into more depth on CAMP in a minute, but yeah. So first goes CAMP.
Yeah, first goes CAMP. They can approve or veto a ZEDE's internal legislation. They can approve or veto the appointment of a technical secretary, and they can audit ZEDEs under management of public resources. Then you have the judicial power. The judicial power has created a special ZEDE judiciary in which they're going to appoint the judges that are going to exert judicial review against the ZEDE governments. And third, you have the residents. The residents have a series of rights and guarantees under international law that essentially turn them into another or additional check against a ZEDE government. So in the end, what you have is a framework. It's a legal framework through which you can create a local government with various mechanisms for control and decision making. This can be, some can be deficient, some can be better than others, but that's what the ZEDE regime broadly allows you to do, to create a local government that differs itself from what you have at the national level. In the case of Prospera, for example, you have several democratic guarantees that you do not have at the national level. You were saying that one of the mechanisms to control ZEDE will be to go to the Honduran court. Well, of course, this is going to be a special judiciary, which is supposed to be more independent and more professional as traditional. But as you might think, that doesn't really provide that much confidence to a person, whether local or foreigner, to be able to appeal to a court. So the Charter of Prospera, it allows all of its residents to essentially sue the ZEDE, not only before a local arbitration tribunal if they choose to, but also before the International Center for Dispute Resolution of the American Arbitration Association. So how it is being deployed, it's actually it provides a lot of guarantees, for the rule of law and also for your civil liberties and democratic rights. If a ZEDE is not respecting your democratic rights, you can take it to arbitration, and the American Arbitration Association, it provides more confidence that perhaps what the judicial power of Honduras does. Another element, it's in Prospera you have the ombudsman. So you have a local ombudsman that is elected by the public, and this ombudsman has the power to access confidential information. So number one, you have an ombudsman. This ombudsman is has a duty to the public, and the public elects the ombudsman and can remove the ombudsman through forced referendum, citizen forced referendum. And this ombudsman has the power to access confidential and privileged information of both Prospera ZEDE and its promoter and organizer. And when the ombudsman is doing its investigation, if the ombudsman determines that there has been a civil rights violation, then it can sue the ZEDE at an arbitration tribunal. So what I'm trying to say is that, and this is important to discuss, because right now a lot of the opposition is being sustained on the, let's say, on theories of what could go wrong. or thinking, let's think about everything that could go wrong, or how can it be, how can the ZEDE regime be used for bad purposes, and that versus actually analyzing how it is being deployed and how it is being used. So of course, if and I mean for the public, because in here the debate is huge, and all of the criticism, a lot of them are based on what could go wrong, or how wrong, how can they be used for bad purposes, versus what is actually being done. And what is actually being done is that you have a jurisdiction that is more democratic than the rest of the national territory, and that it also provides more effective legal tools for the enforcement of laws and for the protection of your human rights and your civil liberties. And that is something we would not have been able to achieve without the ZEDE regime.
So I want to go and move a little bit to CAMP, because this is the regulatory body that sort of manages and supervises the ZEDEs. How is it organized? How is CAMP made up of elected officials? Is it appointed by the government? Is it representatives from the ZEDE? Who's part of CAMP, and what authority do they have?
The CAMP, it's an autonomous institution that was appointed by President Lowe in 2014, approved by Congress, but it has a mechanism in which they select their own members. So the idea of this mechanism was that, was essentially to provide a legal cover or protection, and to guarantee the long-term stability of ZEDEs. What I mean is that if there is a change in government, then under the ZEDE organic law, they would not be able to attack ZEDEs by removing CAMP members and appointing, members that represent this or that political party that's against ZEDE, and then undermining the regime in general. So that was the intention of establishing that procedure of an original appointment by the president, a ratification by Congress, and then CAMP has the ability to elect its own members. Now, the powers of CAMP, they're important, but they're also very limited. Essentially, they have a ministerial duty to serve as a check for compliance with the ZEDE organic law. Their most important powers are that of authorizing the incorporation of low density zones into the ZEDE special regime. But they only have to verify if you comply with the law. If you comply with the legal requirements, then you can access the regime. With regards to ZEDE's internal legislation, the CAMP is not legislators. The CAMP is, they're not. What they had to do is exert control of in here it's called control of legality, constitutionality, and I'm doing direct translation. It's also called control de convencionalidad, or conventional control, which means that you have to check that ZEDE's internal norms are compatible with the ZEDE organic law as a legal norm, with the Constitution of Honduras as a constitutional norm, and then with the norms established by international law. Then again, they perform the audits on the financial resources of ZEDEs. Those are the most important power that the CAMP does. Most of these powers are exerted through a permanent committee. This is a 5-member committee, and this committee is currently composed of Octavio Sanchez, who was the former chief of staff of President Lobo. Then you have Ebal Diaz, who was chief legislative counsel to Juan Orlando Hernandez, at that time president of Congress, now president of the executive power of Honduras. And you have former minister Arnaldo Castillo, who is he was the former minister of the Secretary of Economic Development. And then you have lawyer Carlos Pineda. Carlos Pineda is the alternate secretary of CAMP, and has assumed a very important leadership role within CAMP. So those are the most important powers. Another power that's also very important and also serves as a check from the national government with regards to a ZEDE's autonomy is that CAMP can remove a technical secretary. The technical secretary can be removed by CAMP if CAMP considers that this technical secretary is in violation of laws, or that he has demonstrated that either he's not willing to comply with the law, or that he's unable to perform his duties.
So another criticism of the, and I think that this addresses the question of sovereignty pretty well. But one criticism is that ZEDEs have the ability to basically expropriate people's properties through a process similar to eminent domain, and that although this hasn't really been used yet for any ZEDEs, that ZEDEs basically have the ability to just steal people's land if they want to. So I was wondering if you could address that criticism.
Yes, the ZEDE organic law provides for a mechanism for expropriation. In general, this eminent domain, it's well, that's a constitutional power of the state of Honduras. And
Why did they provide for the power to? Why did they delegate ZEDEs the ability to expropriate land?
A ZEDE can expropriate land within its jurisdiction. In the current case of Prospera and Morazan, within their respective jurisdictions, any expropriation has to be compensated with a 200% market value. So that's that's a guarantee. It's a stronger guarantee.
Could a ZEDE expropriate land to add it to its jurisdiction?
That's where the difference comes in. They can expropriate land within the jurisdiction, but provided they provide the compensation equivalent to 200% of market value of the expropriated asset. Now, with respect to expropriation for expansion, that can only be done through a ZEDE that is financed and structured by the Honduran state. The camp, they have issued an interpretative regulation of for the power of expropriation. All expropriation has to be approved by camp, and camp has adopted a policy based on an interpretation of the law in which any ZEDE that is developed by private developers, they will not be able to exert expropriation powers to expand that ZEDE. The only way that a ZEDE can be expanded is through intervention by the national government. So personally, I'm not a fan of expropriation. I remember 8 years ago when I read the law when it first came out, and I thought, well, they really shouldn't have placed this here. But yes, ZEDEs have not used.
Do you think the law should be amended to have better protections for private property rights for people operating within the ZEDEs? Because it seems like if one of the purposes of the ZEDE is to help improve ease of doing businesses and to create a legal system that improves sort of capitalism, it seems like one of the main reasons why you'd go to a ZEDE in the first place, or an area like that, would be to avoid expropriation. So it seems like it's a very self-defeating role within the legislation.
Well, the thing is that I could say this is not limited to ZEDE. Because this is a conversation about the power of eminent domain. Because even if you remove it from the ZEDE organic law, let's say you remove all references to expropriation, then the state still has a constitutional power to do it. So sure, we can remove that part, and because maybe we don't like to see it, but the hard truth is that whatever the state of Honduras, generally most states around the world, whatever they consider to be of public utility or necessity, they're usually allowed to exert eminent domain powers. Within the ZEDE, what you have is an additional guarantee in which the state cannot expropriate without the approval from the Committee for the Adoption of Best Practices, and if it's related to a particular ZEDE, without the approval of that ZEDE also. So yeah, that's the conversation. And in Honduras, we have this eminent domain for all sorts of projects. Any regular municipal corporation has the power to essentially issue a resolution stating that whether they want to build a road or they want to build a market for displaced people, or essentially it's a very broad power that municipal governments have in Honduras. They can expropriate. The Property Institute can also expropriate. There's another agrarian reform law, which if you have too much land, you can be expropriated. And even the traditional free zones law also has, it also has provisions like that. So if you ask me if I'd like to remove it, well, yes, for sure. If we can remove it, we remove it. But that doesn't mean the government doesn't have the power. That's a power that's not related to ZEDEs. It's just general.
it's not really that the ZEDEs come with this special ability to expropriate. It's just that Honduras as a country has a problem where property rights are weak and a wide variety of government agencies, national, local, municipal, already have the right to expropriate. So the ZEDEs just have eminent domain and this ability as part of just being sort of a normal administrative. So it seems like it's more of a broader problem with Honduras as a whole, as opposed to a specific problem with the ZEDEs.
It is. It is. I think that accurately describes it. But yeah, no. There's of course there has been. Well, I don't know if it's a fear from certain sectors that, of course, the ZEDE regime can be used for wrong purposes or bad purposes, such as expropriating communities. But like I said, that's the general power of the state of Honduras, and this has also been restricted by the camp. So private developers developing a ZEDE cannot expropriate to expand the ZEDE, and
So
it has also been restricted by the own ZEDEs. The own ZEDEs have renounced the possibility to benefit directly or indirectly from any sort of expropriation within their charters.
So if property rights are actually somewhat better protected in a ZEDE than outside of it, why is it that land expropriation has become a major point of criticism for the opposition?
Well, because if you read the law, to be honest, I understand it reads scary. It's because it essentially says what the law says is that the state of Honduras can expropriate to expand ZEDEs, but to do that, it's going to require camp approval and also approval from the ZEDE, which, to be honest, it's the procedure. It's more complex than would usually be required for other expropriations. So that's the reason why. I mean, recently I got asked the same question on a press conference, like, well, why are people afraid? And I said, well, because the law, that's what the law says. But in the context of a heated political year, then I think it's been wrongfully associated as something especially related to ZEDEs. The truth is that the government of Honduras has always been able and will always be able, and most governments in the world have always been able and will always be able to expropriate for these matters. But yeah, so that's the reason why. I mean, the law contains those provisions, and even though camp has restricted it, even though private developers, even though ZEDEs created through private developers cannot expropriate to expand, and even though it's been restrained at the level of the charter of each ZEDE, and even those ZEDEs have agreed to sign intergovernmental agreements that restrain them from benefiting directly or indirectly from expropriation. Right now, the intention is not to fix this matter or provide more certainty to the public. Right now, the intention is to delegitimize ZEDE and kill the project, because this matter has already been controlled at the camp level. It's been controlled at the charters level of each ZEDE, and even Prospera issued a statement saying that they'd agreed if the ZEDE organic law was amended, and even so, ZEDEs have offered municipalities and government of Honduras and citizen associations the opportunity to sign a legally enforceable contract preventing ZEDEs from ever benefiting from direct or indirect expropriation. The opposition doesn't want to fix that, because it's not about expropriation. It's right now it's become a matter of using these particular provisions of the law to justify the political opposition and the killing of the project.
So one last criticism of the ZEDEs that I've seen floating around is that police from the central government cannot enter ZEDEs, and the theory, at least, is that ZEDEs can be used as a harbor for crime. And I know, when you look at the three ZEDEs that currently exist, it's a little bit ridiculous to think that organized crime is going to proliferate in those three. But I think the concern is more that one of these 22 ZEDEs that are in application that you mentioned, Honduras is a country that has a significant amount of organized crime. Do you think that there's a serious legitimate concern that if an organized crime group was able to gain control of a ZEDE, there could be a situation similar to maybe the Golden Triangle in Myanmar or other SEZs that have been hotbeds of organized crime.
I think that particular fear fails to take into account the current situation of Honduras, because a ZEDE, the reason why ZEDE enjoys this level of autonomy, and the reason why the Constitution of Honduras, through an amendment process, recognized this high levels of autonomy, was precisely because there was a political recognition and a general and broader recognition by the public that key institutions within the Honduran government have been corrupted and co-opted by organized crime. So it is, to be honest, I think I would describe it as a little ridiculous, because you're telling me that I cannot create a local independent government that responds to its residents, and you have all these mechanisms, because it will be used for corruption, when when that is the precise reason that I want this autonomy. So they say the police cannot come in. Well, each city is allowed to have its own internal local police, and this is necessary. This is a key part of making cities sustainable, and a key part of why cities are able and will continue to be able to provide security to its residents. Cities have to coordinate efforts with the national government and with the municipal police. But if you know anything about the national Honduran police, you would know that having a local police that is independent, that's a great thing. That's a positive thing. That's a good thing. And you can, I mean, if you do some research, you can Google it. You find Honduran police and ask how many police captains and how much of the top hierarchy of the Honduran police has been requested for extradition by the United States, and how drug cartels used to hire national police department to kill people and to protect drug trade routes, and not only the national police but also the military. So the reason why ZEDEs have high levels of autonomy with regards to criminal law enforcement is because you cannot have clean, independent, professional, and ethical law enforcement if it's dependent to the national criminal enforcement system. So that's the reason why it's there. That's the reason why I think ZEDEs are able to provide its residents and investors with security, and it's precisely because it is not connected with not entirely connected with the national police. It is independent, but it has to coordinate effort. That said, within ZEDEs, you have the same criminal law as in the rest of Honduras, but it is mostly administered by local law enforcement and by the ZEDE special judiciary. And no, I mean, I don't really see. I see ZEDEs as a way to fight back against corrupt practices in the country. Because if your institutions have failed you, then I mean, I think we as Honduras should be happy to have the opportunity to create new institutions and independent institutions that would actually do their job, and that's what we're doing, and I think that's positive, and I think that criminal prosecutions and law enforcement and the strengthening of the rule of law, it's not going to come from the national institutions. They're going to come from the independent prosecutors and police departments of the various cities.
So let's move forward to the current election. You have a lot of people who are very critical of the ZEDE program, who have various criticisms. We've discussed sovereignty, we've discussed land expropriation, we've discussed just generalized crime and corruption. What does the future of the ZEDEs look like after the following election?
I think it's bright. I think it's we're looking at a great future for the ZEDEs and for Honduras broadly. Whatever happens these elections, I think sadly, I think there's going to be some instability as happened on the last elections. Probably social unrest, and that part is going to be hard, you know. But once you go through the electoral process, whatever happens, you're still going to have a poor country, and you're still going to have a national regulatory framework that is killing entrepreneurial spirit and extracting resources from productive enterprises. And people are going to still be on a situation where they need solutions. Over 60% of the country is still going to be poor. Businessmen are still going to be having a really, really hard time. So at that same time, after the elections, with all these problems, you're also going to have ZEDEs as a tool to change that situation, which is something you did not have before. ZEDEs also enjoy a lot of legal stability protections. They were specifically crafted to resist changes in government. So they are protected by international treaties. They are protected by the Honduran Constitution, by the ZEDE Organic Law, and the Constitution can only be amended with a qualified majority. That's 86 lawmakers out of 128 that would have to vote to repeal the ZEDE regime, and they would have to do it in two legislators. So they would have to vote twice on it, on one legislator and then on the other. And but they would not be able to repeal it without violating international treaties. So there's a very important protection there. If the Supreme Court were ever to declare the unconstitutionality of ZEDEs, then that would not be applicable to existing ZEDEs, and the Supreme Court cannot do it because it cannot go against the international obligations of the state of Honduras. And you also have a lot of autonomy with regards to public services administration. So even if a hostile government were to try to undermine the regime, then it's sufficiently autonomous to continue operating.
So what could happen? What could a new government do to try to undermine the ZEDE regime? What should investors worry about?
No, legally, there's nothing they could do. What they could do is extra legal or unlawful acts to undermine the regime, and essentially you would have a problem where you have a CAFTA protected investments. CAFTA is the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and if the government of Honduras commits sufficient unlawful and extra legal acts to undermine the regime, then we could talk about the existence of an indirect expropriation.
So what type of unlawful acts could they do to just sort of throw a wrench in the process?
Well, that's a very broad scope. Anything from stopping merchandise at the customs, or all the way to sending the police into the zone. All of these would be incompatible with the international obligations of the state of Honduras, and and right now with the Constitution and the ZEDE Organic Law. So those are the things that could happen, and if that happened, then the state of Honduras would have violated its international obligations, and there are mechanisms for investors to pursue damages against the state of Honduras. So I think that's a situation where nobody wants to be. I mean, Honduras already has enough problems, and I don't think that any government or politician with good intent for the country wants the next international headline to be Honduras expropriates a CAFTA protected investment. I mean, that would be ridiculous. And I don't think it's likely. I think that scenario is not likely to happen. What I think it will most likely happen is that ZEDEs will continue to develop themselves. Right now, they can be developed in low densities. ZEDEs right now can be developed in low density zones within the coastal departments of Honduras, and those are like 7 departments. And what I expect to see is a lot of more ZEDEs and more special districts. And I think that once people see and actually, well, because they are going to feel the effect of ZEDEs being developed. That effect being higher levels of national, international investment, and more jobs and opportunities. And I think that's what's going to end up legitimizing the overall project is the results. And I also think that's the most likely scenario. Actually, I think that the current I don't think we're going to see a change in government. I think that the National Party will stay in power, and I think that, like I said, next year Hondurans are still going to be facing the same problems. And on the one hand, you have the traditional problems of Honduras, where you have not been able to get them fixed through the regular process, national institutions, and on the other hand, you're going to have ZEDEs, which essentially are one of the most competitive jurisdictions in the world for doing business. So
And I think
that's
the fact that the ZEDEs are one of the most competitive jurisdictions in the world for doing business. I think EY said it would be in like the world's top 10 or something like that. Is potentially quite problematic, I imagine, for a lot of special interests. To me, sort of as an outside observer, it seems like a lot of the opposition to the ZEDEs, political, media, activists, it seems like it's well-funded, well-supported. What sort of economic interests are there sort of behind the scenes pushing against ZEDE legislation? Is it organized crime? Is it labor unions? Is it corporations? What is it?
Right now, it's mostly sectors from the Honduran left and political opposition, and on one side, and on the other, it's yes, it's private businesses.
What type of businesses have an incentive? What type of businesses have an incentive to oppose the ZEDEs? Are there any like particular industries that have a record of spending money to lobby against it, or is this simply a matter where there just isn't that much information available?
Well, there's not that much information available, and also, because it's a small country, I wouldn't like to call them out by name, but what I would say is that companies and business groups operating in certain high regulated industries might have an interest against ZEDEs, because of course, when you have if you operate on a regulated industry, there's barriers to entry to that market, and the ZEDEs represent a dismantling of those barriers to access that particular market. But also, I've seen that there are other business groups that just feel threatened, even if they're not in regulated industries. They feel threatened with regards to power and influence. There are business groups that have traditionally enjoyed very ample amounts of influence and power over government. Right now, it's been diminished, because let's just say that at the national level, it's not very. You don't really have a pro-business environment, and the influence from these sectors has been diminished during the last 10 years, but they're still very powerful. And I think they might see the ZEDEs as, the final nail to the coffin, because it really introduces a new sector of economic influence and power, essentially, which I think they're not taking very well.
So Honduras is one of the last countries in the world that still recognizes Taiwan and doesn't recognize the People's Republic of China, doesn't recognize mainland China. And a major contributor to the Honduran economy are Taiwanese subsidies, especially agricultural subsidies. To what extent is there Taiwanese and Chinese involvement over the ZEDEs? Are the ZEDEs sort of alongside? I've seen a number of articles and reports and documents suggesting that there's plans for both Taiwanese and mainland Chinese ZEDEs, but none of it seems to have ever materialized or come forth publicly. Is there anything you can publicly say about that?
No, to be honest, I'm not aware. Well, I've heard probably the same sources as you have, and there has been interest. I know from well, I think from both China's, from both Taiwan and from mainland China, to invest within the ZEDE regime. And of course, there were the original studies that were made by the South Korean International Aid Development Agency that they had. No, they never materialized. I don't know if within those 22 applications, which are confidential and I don't have access to, we will see some investment there. But yes, Honduras has a relationship, has a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. The one of the main opposing parties right now, which is the Libre Party, it's a very left wing. Well, they're talking about. They say that if they win, they're going to cut relationships with Taiwan and establish relationships with the People's Republic of China. And so I thought that was interesting. And on the other hand, while we have ZEDEs, this special zones, and a lot of them are being developed with U.S. investors in El Salvador. They recently announced a new special economic zone that it's actually pretty big, and it has over 25 municipalities within its spatial ambit, or jurisdiction, and that one is being developed by China. From the documents I've seen, they are planning to invest up to $21 billion, and it's a 200 years of operation contract. So the operation of the special economic zone would be granted to I don't know if it's I think it's China. I don't know if it's the Chinese government or Chinese government associated investors, but that's something that's going on. That's right next to our borders. So I think this creates a very interesting scenario for U.S. Foreign policy, where they have Central America, in which number one, El Salvador just recently switched from recognizing Taiwan to China, and now they're building a top special economic zone with $21 billion investment and 200 years contract for operation of that CES. And in Honduras, you have one of the very powerful political opposition candidates saying that they will also make the switch and go to China. So yeah, I think it's an interesting scenario. I don't think Honduras, I don't think the opposition will win Honduras, and I don't think Honduras will switch. But what we have is that scenario. We have two different types of zone that are essentially going to be competing. ZEDEs are way more advanced with respect of their autonomy and their power to enact a differentiated legislation and create a more competitive governance structures. So the ZEDEs have that going for them. But overall, the amounts of investment that are being at least publicly disclosed, they circle around $700 million, while on the other side you have a zone that's it's socially way bigger. In Honduras, the cities, one is they're a couple of hundred acres each, and in El Salvador, you're basically talking about, I don't remember how many square kilometers, but it's 25 municipalities. It's a
like
huge
14% of the coastline and something
it's
huge like
incredible.
that.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be interesting to see how it goes forward in terms of regional competition and of U.S. and Chinese foreign policy.
So I think that we're almost out of time, so I have a few last questions. First of all, suppose there's an American investor who sees the ZEDE as an opportunity to really get in on potentially the world's next most hyper-competitive jurisdiction, and this investor can stomach all of the political risk, all of the electoral risk, and in fact maybe even sees that risk as something, as a competitive factor that will prevent other people from getting in as early. Suppose it's the type of person who's looking for the next Bitcoin style investor. What would you like that investor to know about the ZEDEs?
Well, I think that the most clear advantage of ZEDEs, particularly Prospera ZEDE, it's its ability to provide a regulatory arbitrage. What I mean is that Prospera has reciprocity with 30 OECD countries, which means that regulated industries operating in Prospera can elect to do business under the regulatory codes of either one of 30 OECD countries. Jurisdictions such as the US, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Hong Kong, Dubai. So that really gives you the opportunity to set yourself up in a jurisdiction, and independently of the industry that you're trying to develop, whether it be finance or tech or biology or construction, you're going to have an advantage that is not really enjoyed, I think, anywhere else in the world, in which you have perhaps what's the broadest amount of regulatory choice in the world. And if you don't really adapt to either of these 30 regulatory codes for these regulated industries, then you can also opt to present your own proposal for optimal regulations. So optimal regulations allow a company to essentially craft their own regulatory code and compliance program, whether it be a combination of existing codes from best practice peer countries, which are these 30 OECD countries I'm talking about, or just new and innovative regulations to foster new industries or to adapt to an already existing industry that has perhaps been restrained or limited by existing regulation. I think that's the most important part in terms of perhaps for the type of investor that you're describing, interested in new technologies and the next big thing or possibility. Yeah, I think that would definitely be it.
If the Honduras ZEDE program, survives the election and thrives, it really has a potential to be a very exciting opportunity. It has the potential to just become this tremendously competitive jurisdiction that nobody in the region and perhaps nobody even in the world could compete with. So it's really an exciting program. And I really hope that to any investors that are listening, and I know that at least a few of you are, that the potential risks involved with the program and the potential criticisms are seen more of as challenges rather than barriers. I think that's sort of very important to see these as sort of things that need to be addressed and things that need to be worked around, but not necessarily things that should prevent, seriously considering potentially getting in on what could be something that not only changes the world, but causes a whole wave of imitation and really has this impact. So on that positive note, I think that I'm going to end. Where can our listeners find out more about you, about Inertia, about Prospera, about projects you're working on? What are a few places? And all of the links, as usual, will be in the description below.
Yes, for sure. If you're interested in Prospera, I would recommend, of course, the Prospera website, prospera.hn, but also that one is for the developer. That's the Honduras Prospera website. But there's also a website for the Prospera jurisdiction, which is the local public government entity, that it's pcgps.hn, where you can find all the rules and regulations pertaining to Prospera, which happens to be one of the most transparent institutions in the state of Honduras. And my website is SPI Inertia.com. Essentially, you can find information about how to create your entities in Prospera and how to I have a special section there where all of the legal foundations of ZEDEs are showcased, including the customs code and the ZEDE special judiciary, and essentially everything the Honduran government has ever approved pertaining to ZEDE, and also economic information about the country. So I think those would be great resources for people who want to learn more. And the official CAMP website, I think it's been, it's ZEDE, just ZEDE.hn. I think it's been redeveloped right now or remodeled, but it has very useful information with regards to international investment treaties ratified by the state of Honduras and all the various guarantees that international law provides for foreign investors in Honduras.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us. And I think this podcast is probably going to be the internet's most systematic treatment of anti-ZEDE arguments up to so far. So thank you very much for coming on.
No, thank you for the invite. Very pleased to participate, and thanks for having me. I'm sure that ZEDEs will enable a very promising future, not only for Honduras, but also for the region. So thank you.